The clock struck midnight on September 8th, 2022, and in that single moment, everything changed forever. In a quiet room at Balmoral Castle, Scotland, Queen Elizabeth II took her final breath, and with it, the longest reign in British history came to an end. Across the world, millions of people woke up to a reality they had never known, a Britain without the Queen they had grown up with, loved, and respected for over 70 years. But as one chapter closed, another began. At that exact moment, Charles Philip Arthur George became King Charles III, inheriting not just a crown, but the weight of a 1,000-year-old monarchy, the hopes of a nation, and the responsibility to guide Britain into an uncertain future. The question that echoed through palaces, parliament halls, and ordinary homes across the Commonwealth was not just when he would be crowned, but whether this man, who had waited longer than any heir in British history, could fill the enormous shoes left behind by his beloved mother. This is the extraordinary true story of how a 73-year-old prince became a king, how a nation prepared for its most important ceremony in 70 years, and how one historic day would either unite or divide a country struggling with its place in the modern world. It's a tale of ancient traditions meeting modern realities, of family secrets and public scrutiny, of a man who spent his entire life preparing for a job he never truly wanted but always knew he must do. The coronation of King Charles III would become more than just a ceremony. It would be a mirror reflecting Britain's past, present, and future, all wrapped up in a single, unforgettable day that the world would never forget. The rain fell softly on the Scottish Highlands as news spread like wildfire across the globe. Queen Elizabeth II, the woman who had been the steady heartbeat of Britain for 7 decades, was gone. In living rooms, offices, and pubs across the United Kingdom, people stopped what they were doing and stared at their screens in disbelief. For most, it felt impossible. The Queen had always been there, like the sunrise or the changing of seasons, a constant in an ever-changing world. Charles had been expecting this moment his entire life. Yet when it finally arrived, nothing could have prepared him for the reality of it. Standing in the Scottish castle where his mother had spent her final days, he felt the weight of centuries pressing down on his shoulders. In an instant, he had transformed from the Prince of Wales, a role he had held for more than 50 years, to King Charles III, sovereign of the United Kingdom and head of the Commonwealth realms. The next few hours would be a blur of protocol, procedure, and profound grief. While the nation mourned, the machinery of monarchy had to continue turning. Charles had to approve his mother's death certificate, meet with government officials, and begin the complex process of transitioning from one reign to another. But, perhaps most challenging of all, he had to find a way to honor his mother's legacy while establishing his own vision for the future of the monarchy. The first major decision facing the new king was one that would set the tone for his entire reign, when and how to hold his coronation. Unlike the immediate assumption of royal duties, which happened automatically upon his mother's death, the coronation ceremony was a choice. Some advisors suggested waiting a full year out of respect for the mourning period. Others argued that the country needed stability and continuity, and that a swift coronation would provide exactly that. Charles himself was torn. Throughout his long apprenticeship as heir to the throne, he had developed strong ideas about how the monarchy should evolve. He wanted a smaller, more efficient royal family, a more environmentally conscious approach to royal duties, and a coronation that would reflect modern Britain while respecting ancient traditions. But he also understood that his first major decision as king would be scrutinized by millions of people around the world, many of whom were still processing the loss of his beloved mother. The discussions about the coronation began almost immediately. In the ornate rooms of Buckingham Palace, centuries-old protocols were dusted off and examined. The last coronation had been his mother's in 1953, a grand spectacle that had been watched by millions on the relatively new medium of television. But 2023 was a different world entirely. Social media, streaming services, and global connectivity meant that every moment of Charles's coronation would be dissected, analyzed, and shared instantly across the planet. The planning committee faced unprecedented challenges. How do you organize a ceremony that honors tradition while acknowledging that Britain in 2023 was vastly different from Britain in 1953? The country was now far more diverse, more secular, and more questioning of authority than it had been 70 years earlier. Young people who had grown up with social media were less deferential to institutions, more concerned about inequality, and more likely to question why anyone should inherit power simply because of their bloodline. Charles was acutely aware of these changing attitudes. Throughout his time as Prince of Wales, he had worked hard to modernize his image and connect with younger generations. He had championed environmental causes long before they became mainstream, spoken out about social issues, and tried to use his platform to make a positive difference in the world. Now, as king, he had the opportunity to put these values into practice on the grandest stage possible. The decision about the timing of the coronation became even more complex when economic factors were considered. Britain in 2022 and 2023 was facing significant financial challenges. The cost of living was rising, energy bills were soaring, and many families were struggling to make ends meet. The idea of spending millions of pounds on a lavish ceremony while ordinary people worried about heating their homes or feeding their children was politically and morally problematic. Charles himself was deeply concerned about this issue. He had always been aware of his privileged position, but the contrast between royal wealth and ordinary hardship had never felt more stark. He wanted his coronation to be memorable and meaningful, but not at the expense of appearing tone-deaf to the struggles of his future subjects. The solution that emerged was typically British, a compromise that tried to balance multiple competing demands. The coronation would be held in May 2023, giving enough time for proper preparation while not delaying too long. It would be smaller than previous coronations, but still grand enough to mark the historic significance of the moment. Most importantly, it would incorporate elements that reflected modern Britain while maintaining the essential traditions that gave the ceremony its power and meaning. The announcement of the coronation date, May 6, 2023, was met with mixed reactions. Monarchists were thrilled to have something to celebrate after months of mourning. Republicans questioned whether such an expensive ceremony was appropriate in difficult economic times. The media went into overdrive, with every aspect of the planning becoming front-page news. For Charles, the announcement marked the beginning of the most intense period of his life. Every decision, from the guest list to the music, from the decorations to the menu for the coronation banquet, would be scrutinized and debated. He would have to navigate between the expectations of traditionalists who wanted everything to remain exactly as it had been for his mother's coronation, and modernizers who wanted to see significant changes that reflected contemporary values. The pressure was immense, but Charles had been preparing for this moment his entire life. As a young man, he had often felt frustrated by the constraints of his royal role, wishing he could speak more freely about the issues he cared about. Now, as king, he had the opportunity to shape not just his own coronation, but the future direction of the monarchy itself. The planning process revealed just how complex modern monarchy had become. Every decision had to consider not just British public opinion, but the views of the 14 other Commonwealth realms where Charles was also head of state. Some of these countries were reconsidering their relationship with the monarchy entirely, and the coronation would be seen as a test of whether Charles could maintain the unity that his mother had worked so hard to preserve. As winter turned to spring, the pace of preparation intensified. Westminster Abbey, the site of every coronation for nearly 1,000 years, underwent careful restoration. The crown jewels were prepared for their starring role. Guest lists were finalized, with careful attention paid to representing the diversity of modern Britain and the Commonwealth. Every detail was planned with military precision, because everyone involved understood that this would be one of the most watched events in television history. But perhaps the most important preparation was happening within Charles himself. For decades, he had been the heir apparent, always one step removed from ultimate responsibility. Now he was the king, and on May 6th, 2023, he would participate in a ceremony that would formally acknowledge his role as the constitutional head of state, the symbolic leader of the nation, and the inheritor of a tradition stretching back more than a millennium. The world was watching, history was calling, and King Charles III was about to take his place on the stage where his destiny had always been leading him. As the spring of 2023 approached, Westminster Abbey became the center of one of the most complex logistical operations in British history. The ancient church, which had witnessed the coronations of kings and queens for nearly 1,000 years, was being prepared for an event that would need to balance centuries-old traditions with the demands of modern technology and contemporary sensibilities. The Abbey staff worked around the clock to prepare the sacred space. Every stone was cleaned, every wooden pew was polished, and every piece of medieval architecture was carefully inspected. But this wasn't just about making the building look beautiful. It was about creating a space that could accommodate the most sophisticated television production ever attempted in Britain, while still maintaining the spiritual and historical atmosphere that made the ceremony so powerful. Television crews faced challenges that their predecessors in 1953 could never have imagined. The coronation would be broadcast live to every continent, streamed online in dozens of languages, and watched by an estimated global audience of 2 billion people. Camera positions had to be carefully planned to capture every moment without disrupting the sacred nature of the ceremony. Lighting had to be adjusted to show the magnificent details of the Abbey's architecture, while ensuring that television viewers could see everything clearly. The most complex challenge was balancing tradition with modernity. Charles had made it clear from the beginning that he wanted his coronation to reflect the Britain he would be ruling, a diverse, multicultural, modern democracy that still respected its history and traditions. This meant incorporating elements that had never been part of a coronation before, while ensuring that the essential spiritual and constitutional elements remained unchanged. One of the most significant innovations was the decision to include representatives from different faith communities in the ceremony. While the coronation remained fundamentally a Christian service, reflecting the king's role as supreme governor of the Church of England, Charles insisted that other faith leaders should have a role in the proceedings. This was controversial among traditionalists, but the king felt strongly that his coronation should reflect the religious diversity of modern Britain. The guest list itself became a masterpiece of diplomatic complexity. Every invitation carried political significance, and the Palace Protocol Office worked for months to ensure that no one who should be included was left out, while keeping the ceremony small enough to maintain its intimate, sacred character. Heads of state from around the world would attend, along with representatives from every part of British society, from business leaders and charity workers to teachers, nurses, and volunteers who represented the best of British values. The music for the coronation presented another fascinating challenge. The ceremony would feature some of the most beautiful and ancient music in the Christian tradition, pieces that have been sung at coronations for hundreds of years. But Charles also wanted to include contemporary compositions that reflected the cultural richness of modern Britain. New pieces were commissioned from composers representing different musical traditions, creating a soundtrack that honored the past while embracing the future. Perhaps the most delicate aspect of the planning involved the royal family itself. The months following Queen Elizabeth's death had been emotionally challenging for all of them, and there were ongoing tensions that threatened to overshadow the coronation. The relationship between Charles and his younger son Harry remained strained following Harry's decision to step back from royal duties and move to America with his wife Meghan. The question of whether Harry and Meghan would attend the coronation became a media obsession, with every rumor and speculation making front-page news. Charles desperately wanted his family to be united for this historic moment, but he also understood that he couldn't force reconciliation. The palace tried to manage the situation diplomatically, extending invitations while making it clear that attendance was a personal choice. The uncertainty added an extra layer of stress to an already incredibly complex event. Meanwhile, the broader preparations for the coronation weekend were taking shape across London. The government had designated the coronation a special holiday, giving people a long weekend to celebrate. Street parties were being organized in communities across the country, echoing the celebrations that had marked previous royal jubilees and weddings. Local councils worked with community groups to organize events that would bring people together and create a sense of national celebration. Security preparations were perhaps the most challenging aspect of the entire operation, with world leaders, members of royal families, and hundreds of other VIPs attending, along with thousands of members of the public lining the streets. The Metropolitan Police faced an unprecedented security challenge. Every route was carefully planned, every building along the procession path was inspected, and coordination with intelligence services reached levels normally reserved for major international summits. The economic impact of the coronation was also significant. Hotels across London were fully booked months in advance, with visitors coming from around the world to witness history. Souvenir manufacturers worked overtime to produce commemorative items, from simple mugs and tea towels to expensive jewelry and artwork. The tourism industry estimated that the coronation would bring hundreds of millions of pounds into the British economy, providing a much-needed boost during challenging economic times. But not everyone was celebrating. Republican groups organized protests and counter-events, arguing that the monarchy was an outdated institution that had no place in a modern democracy. They questioned the cost of the ceremony, the principle of inherited privilege, and the relevance of the monarchy to contemporary British life. While these protesters represented a minority of the population, their voices added to the complex political atmosphere surrounding the coronation. Charles himself spent the final weeks before the coronation in intensive preparation. He practiced the complex choreography of the ceremony until every movement became second nature. He studied the historical significance of each element, understanding not just what he would be doing, but why each action mattered. Most importantly, he reflected on the promises he would make and what they meant for his reign and for the future of the monarchy. The spiritual preparation was perhaps the most important aspect of Charles's personal journey toward coronation. While he had always been a man of faith, the prospect of taking sacred oaths in Westminster Abbey, surrounded by centuries of history and watched by billions of people, was profoundly moving. He spent time in prayer and meditation, considering the weight of the responsibilities he was about to formally accept. As the coronation date approached, the anticipation became almost tangible. Flags appeared on houses and public buildings across the United Kingdom. Television schedules were cleared to provide comprehensive coverage. Newspapers produced special supplements exploring every aspect of the ceremony and its significance. The entire country seemed to hold its breath, waiting for a moment that would mark not just the crowning of a new king, but the beginning of a new era in British history. The final rehearsals took place in the week before the coronation, with everyone involved practicing their roles until the ceremony could proceed like clockwork. The precision required was extraordinary. Every step, every word, every gesture had to be perfectly timed and executed. There would be no opportunity for mistakes on the day itself, when the eyes of the world would be watching every moment. For Charles, these final days were a time of intense emotion. He thought often of his mother, wishing she could be there to see him take the final step in a journey that had begun on the day of his birth. He felt the weight of history and tradition, but also the excitement of new possibilities. He was about to become not just a king, but a king for the 21st century, with all the opportunities and challenges that role would bring. The stage was set, the preparations were complete, and the world was ready to witness one of the most significant ceremonial events in modern history. King Charles III was about to be crowned, and nothing would ever be quite the same again. The morning of May 6th, 2023, dawned crisp and clear over London, as if the weather itself understood the historic significance of the day ahead. Across the city, people had been camping on the streets since the early hours, securing the best views for what many considered the most important royal event of their lifetimes. The atmosphere was electric with anticipation, excitement, and for many, a deep sense of participating in living history. At Buckingham Palace, King Charles III woke early, having slept little despite his exhaustion from weeks of intensive preparation. Today, he would participate in a ceremony that would formally transform him from a man who had inherited a title into a divinely anointed monarch, surrounded by rituals that connected him directly to more than 1,000 years of British royal tradition. The weight of that responsibility had never felt heavier or more real. The king's morning routine was carefully choreographed, every moment planned to ensure he arrived at Westminster Abbey in the perfect frame of mind for the most important day of his life. He spent time in private prayer, reflecting on the promises he was about to make and asking for the wisdom and strength to fulfill them. His valet helped him into the first of several ceremonial outfits he would wear throughout the day, beginning with the crimson velvet robe of state that would be worn for the journey to the Abbey. Meanwhile, across London, the final preparations were reaching their climax. Westminster Abbey had been transformed into a setting that seemed to exist outside of ordinary time, where ancient stones bore witness to ceremonies that stretched back to the very foundations of English monarchy. The altar had been prepared with sacred oils that would be used for the anointing, the most sacred moment of the entire ceremony. The St. Edward's crown, the 5-pound masterpiece of medieval craftsmanship that had crowned monarchs for centuries, sat waiting in its place of honor. Television crews around the world were completing their final preparations, knowing that their coverage would be watched by more people than had ever witnessed a single live event in human history. Commentators prepared to explain the significance of rituals that most viewers had never seen before, helping global audiences understand the deep meaning behind actions that might appear strange or anachronistic to modern eyes. The procession from Buckingham Palace to Westminster Abbey began precisely on schedule, with the kind of military precision that had become a hallmark of British royal ceremonies. The Diamond Jubilee State Coach, a magnificent vehicle that combined traditional craftsmanship with modern technology, carried the king through streets lined with thousands of people who had traveled from across Britain and around the world to witness this historic moment. The crowds were extraordinary in their diversity, reflecting the modern Britain that Charles was about to formally lead. Families who had traveled hundreds of miles stood next to international tourists, all united in their desire to be part of history. Many wore elaborate costumes inspired by royal fashion throughout the ages, while others carried flags and banners celebrating the monarchy. The atmosphere was festive, but also deeply respectful, as if everyone understood they were participating in something much larger than themselves. As the royal procession made its way through London's historic streets, the television commentary provided context for viewers around the world. Experts explained the significance of each element of the ceremony they were about to witness, from the ancient origins of the coronation service to the modern adaptations that Charles had insisted upon. The global audience was learning about British history and tradition in real time, making the coronation not just a national celebration, but an international cultural event. Inside Westminster Abbey, the congregation was taking their places for a ceremony that would blend the sacred and the secular in ways that only a coronation could achieve. World leaders sat alongside representatives of charities and community organizations. Religious leaders from multiple faiths prepared to participate in a ceremony that remained fundamentally Christian, but acknowledged the religious diversity of contemporary Britain. The music began with ancient hymns that had echoed through the Abbey for centuries, creating an atmosphere of reverence and anticipation. The moment when King Charles entered the Abbey was electric. Dressed in his crimson robe and moving with the dignity that comes from a lifetime of royal training, he processed down the nave toward the altar where he would take the most important vows of his life. The congregation rose as one, and the sound of their movement created a rustling whisper that seemed to acknowledge the presence of history itself. The early stages of the service followed traditions established hundreds of years earlier, but with subtle modifications that reflected Charles's vision for a more inclusive monarchy. Representatives from different faith communities offered prayers and blessings, acknowledging that the king would rule over subjects of many different beliefs. The music included both ancient compositions and newly commissioned works that incorporated musical traditions from across the Commonwealth. The recognition ceremony, where the congregation formally acknowledged Charles as their rightful king, was one of the most emotionally powerful moments of the entire service. As the Archbishop of Canterbury presented the king to the congregation, asking if they were willing to do homage and service, the response of "God save King Charles" echoed through the ancient abbey with a force that seemed to make the very stones vibrate. This was democracy in its most traditional form, the people formally accepting their monarch. But it was the anointing ceremony that truly transformed the event from a grand public spectacle into something sacred and mysterious. Hidden from the television cameras by a screen that preserved the privacy of this most holy moment, Charles was anointed with oil that had been consecrated according to ancient formulas. This was the moment when he ceased to be simply a man with a crown and became, in the eyes of believers, a divinely appointed monarch. The symbolism was profound, connecting him not just to his predecessors, but to a tradition of sacred kingship that stretched back to biblical times. The actual crowning, when the St. Edward's crown was placed on Charles's head, was the climax toward which the entire ceremony had been building. The moment of contact between the ancient gold and the king's head represented a transfer of authority that went beyond anything that could be achieved through elections or appointments. This was power transmitted through ritual, tradition, and faith, making Charles not just a political leader, but a living symbol of national continuity and identity. The congregation's response to the crowning was immediate and overwhelming. "God save the king" rang out with such force that it seemed to shake the abbey's ancient foundations. Outside, the crowds who had been watching on large screens erupted in celebration, their cheers mixing with the sound of church bells ringing across London. Gun salutes thundered from the Tower of London and other historic sites, announcing to the world that Britain had a newly crowned king. The investiture with the royal regalia that followed the crowning was rich with symbolism that connected Charles to every aspect of his royal role. The golden orb represented his role as defender of the faith and protector of the church. The scepter symbolized his temporal authority over his subjects. Each piece of regalia carried centuries of history and meaning, making Charles not just an individual ruler, but part of an unbroken chain of monarchy stretching back through the ages. The homage paid by senior members of the royal family and other nobles was another moment of profound emotion. Watching his son William kneel before him and pledge his loyalty brought tears to Charles's eyes as he thought of the long journey that had brought them both to this moment. The ceremony was making real the transfer of generations that would one day see William himself in this same position. As the service moved toward its conclusion with communion and final prayers, the atmosphere in the abbey remained electric with significance. This wasn't just the end of a ceremony, but the beginning of a new era in British history. Charles had been transformed from heir to king, from prince to monarch, from a man waiting for his destiny to a sovereign ready to lead his nation into an uncertain but hopeful future. The final moments of the coronation service prepared everyone for the next phase of this historic day, the return journey to Buckingham Palace, and the appearance on the famous balcony that would allow the newly crowned king to acknowledge the cheers of his subjects and the congratulations of the world. As the sun began to set over London on May 6, 2023, the formal ceremonies of the coronation were complete, but the real work of being King Charles III was just beginning. The ancient crown had been placed on his head, the sacred oaths had been taken, and the world had witnessed the peaceful transfer of monarchical authority from one generation to the next. But for Charles, the end of the coronation day marked not a conclusion, but a beginning, the start of a reign that would define his legacy and shape Britain's future for decades to come. In the private apartments of Buckingham Palace, away from the cameras and the crowds, the newly crowned king finally had a moment to reflect on the extraordinary day he had just experienced. Still wearing the robes of state, he looked out over the London skyline and contemplated the magnitude of what had just occurred. The boy who had been made heir to the throne at the age of 3 had finally fulfilled his destiny, but in doing so, he had also accepted responsibilities that would last for the rest of his life. The coronation banquet that evening brought together family, friends, and distinguished guests in an atmosphere that was both celebratory and reflective. The guest list represented a carefully chosen cross-section of British society and the international community, world leaders who would work with Charles in his new role, representatives of charities and organizations he had supported as Prince of Wales, and family members who had shared his long journey to the throne. The atmosphere at the banquet was relaxed despite the formal setting. For the first time in months, Charles could enjoy himself without worrying about every detail of protocol and preparation. The conversations flowed freely, mixing serious discussions about the future with lighter moments of humor and reminiscence. Many guests commented on how natural Charles seemed in his new role, as if he had been born to be king, which of course he had. During his speech at the banquet, Charles struck themes that would come to define his reign. He spoke about the importance of service, both his own service to the nation and the service that millions of ordinary people provided to their communities every day. He emphasized his commitment to environmental protection, social justice, and interfaith dialogue, causes he had championed as Prince of Wales and would now pursue with the full authority of the crown behind him. The international guests at the banquet were particularly interested in Charles's vision for the Commonwealth, the voluntary association of nations that had been one of his mother's greatest passions. Many Commonwealth countries were reconsidering their relationship with the monarchy, and Charles's ability to maintain the unity his mother had fostered would be one of the key tests of his reign. His speech that evening struck notes of respect, partnership, and mutual benefit that suggested he understood the delicate diplomacy required to keep the Commonwealth together. As the evening wore on and guests began to depart, Charles found himself in conversation with world leaders who would become his partners in addressing global challenges. Climate change, international security, economic inequality, and technological disruption were just some of the issues that would define his reign. Unlike previous monarchs who had reigned during more stable times, Charles would be king during an era of rapid change and uncertainty that would require all his skills and experience to navigate successfully. The media coverage of the coronation continued well into the night and dominated news cycles for days afterward. Analysis of every aspect of the ceremony filled newspapers, magazines, and television programs around the world. The consensus was overwhelmingly positive, with commentators praising both the magnificence of the spectacle and the way it had been adapted to reflect contemporary values and sensibilities. Social media provided a new dimension to coronation coverage that hadn't existed for any previous royal ceremony. Millions of people shared their own photos and videos of the day, creating a collective record of the coronation from thousands of different perspectives. Hashtags related to the coronation trended globally for days, with people from every continent sharing their thoughts and reactions to what they had witnessed. The economic impact of the coronation was substantial and long-lasting. The tourism boost began immediately, with hotels, restaurants, and attractions across London experiencing unprecedented demand. Souvenir sales reached record levels, with everything from simple commemorative mugs to expensive jewelry featuring coronation themes flying off the shelves. The broader economic benefits, including increased international interest in British culture and products, would continue for months and years to come. In the weeks following the coronation, Charles began to establish the rhythm and style that would characterize his reign. His first official engagements as the Crown King were carefully chosen to reflect his priorities and values. He visited environmental projects, met with young entrepreneurs, and continued his support for interfaith dialogue, all causes that had been important to him as Prince of Wales and would now be central to his work as king. The response to these early engagements was encouraging, suggesting that the public was ready to accept Charles's vision for a more active, engaged monarchy. His willingness to speak out on issues he cared about, while staying within constitutional boundaries, was seen as a refreshing change that made the monarchy more relevant to contemporary concerns. The international community also responded positively to the early months of Charles's reign. His first state visits, as king, were successful diplomatic ventures that strengthened Britain's relationships with key allies. His speeches at international forums were well received, establishing him as a thoughtful voice on global issues who could command respect and attention from world leaders. Perhaps most importantly, Charles's relationship with the British people seemed to strengthen in the months following the coronation. Polls showed increasing approval for both the king personally and the monarchy as an institution. The coronation had reminded people of the positive aspects of constitutional monarchy, its ability to provide stability, continuity, and national unity in times of change and uncertainty. The success of the coronation also had implications for the future of the monarchy. Charles's vision of a smaller, more focused royal family seemed to be working, with public attention concentrated on the working members of the family who carried out official duties. The ceremony had demonstrated that ancient traditions could be adapted for modern times without losing their essential meaning and power. Looking back on the coronation a year later, historians and commentators agreed that May 6, 2023, had marked a successful transition from one era to another. The ceremony had honored the past while embracing the future, maintained tradition while acknowledging change, and celebrated British values while recognizing the country's diversity and complexity. For Charles himself, the first anniversary of his coronation was a time for quiet satisfaction and renewed commitment. The ceremony had been everything he had hoped it would be: dignified, meaningful, inclusive, and inspiring. More importantly, it had provided a strong foundation for a reign that was already showing signs of being both successful and transformative. As he reflected on the year that had passed since that historic May morning, Charles could see the evidence of positive change everywhere he looked. The monarchy was more popular than it had been in years. Britain's international reputation had been enhanced, and the country seemed more confident about its place in the world. The coronation had achieved its primary purpose, not just to crown a new king, but to mark the beginning of a new chapter in the long story of British constitutional monarchy. The crown that had felt so heavy on coronation morning now seemed to sit more naturally on his head. Charles had grown into his role as king with a grace and authority that surprised even those who had known him longest. The man who had waited so long to fulfill his destiny had proven himself worthy of the trust placed in him, and the future of the monarchy looked bright under his leadership. The coronation of King Charles III would be remembered as one of the great ceremonial events of the 21st century. But more than that, it will be seen as the moment when an ancient institution successfully reinvented itself for a new age, ensuring its continued relevance and importance for generations to come.